to see. You can't change me, cause I'm people army for life. It's plain to see. You can't change me, cause I'm people.
Yeah, I'd like to welcome everyone here to the Hill District. We're part of a group called the Black Socialist Formation. We actually just started the formation not long ago, a few months back. But we started out as a study group about a year ago to really start to build a Black socialist presence in Pittsburgh and this region. And there hasn't been one in an organized form. And that's our goal, is to really build that over time. We're in this space. We can go to the next slide. We're in this space, which is part of the Center for Family Excellence. Also the offices of the Hill District Consensus Group, the Fresh Project, and Scholar House have offices in this space. At one point, this was the library, it was the Hill District Carnegie Library. But this space is used by a lot of different groups in the community for a lot of different things. We can't eat in this room. If you need to eat, you need to go in another room. The restrooms are way down into the hall, and there's some restrooms that say men and women, and they're locked. But then there's two other restrooms say restrooms on it, and they're open. But you should leave the door open when you leave, because if you lock it, it's just locked and you won't get in. Next slide. We're going to record this session, and we'll make sure it on YouTube and maybe in some other ways. Basically, if you don't want your picture taken, I'm not sure what we'll do. We can figure out a way that your picture won't be on here. You can sit somewhere else, or we can wear 3 masks on your face or something like that. But this is a hybrid session. We have people online and people here in the room. Keep moving. Just right now, let's go around and just talk about who we are, our pronouns, and what neighborhood we're from. And for the people online, if you can put yours in the chat and we'll read off the chat. My name's Carl Redwood. I live on Center Avenue, about 8 blocks that way. And I've been active around a lot of stuff here in the Hill District community, but also throughout the region.
My name is Omid. Any pronoun. I live in Scorpio. I've been in Pittsburgh only for 2 years, so next time.
Oh, my name is Sam, he, him. I live in Squirrel Hill too.
I'm Allie, they, she pronouns, also in Squirrel
America, you, she, they pronouns, and I live in Swiss Home.
Hey, I'm Frames, he, him pronouns, and I'm living in Bloomfield right now.
I'm Claire, I'm she, her, and I live in Highland Park.
Hi everyone, I'm Crystal, she, her, and I live in Squirrel Hill too.
So, Justin, he, him, and I'm in Brookline.
I am Dante, I'm they, them, and I'm in Sharpsburg. And also joining us in the Zoom, we have Paul, they from Mount Lebanon, Billy Jackson, and we have Kellyanne, she, her from Brighton Heights, and we have Yasmin, or Jazz, she, her from Bloomfield.
Welcome, everyone. And Carl spoke a little bit about what the Black Socialist Formation is already with us.
Yeah, just a little bit more. Like, what we've been doing is studying the intersection of a whole lot of different kind of theoretical and ideological traditions that come out of the Black community: pan-africanism, socialism, Black feminism, Black nationalism, and how they intersect is really what we've been doing. Because our movements have been created by our people, and they've erupted in many different forms over centuries, actually. And those particular formations or ideologies are unique to the African American experience, but also to the generalized African experience throughout the world. And that's like how we enter into socialism, is to look at it in the framework, the larger framework of the struggles that our people have been in over many, many centuries, actually. Our study group meets regularly. We meet on a regular basis, and we invite Black folks who believe that Black people will never achieve liberation under capitalism. That's kind of like one of the principles. That's like an entering principle for us as we study socialism, or some people would say socialisms with the S on the end.
Thank you, appreciate it. All right, yeah, so today, today's teaching, we're gonna be discussing two things today. One of the things we're gonna be focusing on, which is, the title of what we put out, our promo, and what we're focused around for this whole month of action, is the U.S. Military Command in Africa, otherwise known as AFRICOM. So we're gonna be learning about what that is and what that means for Black people globally, Black people on the continent of Africa, of course, but Black people around the world and people around the world in general. And we're doing this again, as I just mentioned, engaging with the Black Alliance for Peace Month of Action, International Month of Action against AFRICOM. If you're not already familiar with the Black Alliance for Peace, we're going to talk a little bit about that organization a little later on in the presentation. But that's one piece of what we're talking about today. The other part of what we're going to be talking about today is what is known as the Alliance of Sahel States, recently formed a confederation called the Alliance of Sahel States, and how they're resisting neo-colonialism and Western military intervention. Not Western military intervention being AFRICOM, but also other forms of Western military intervention. So, welcome. Yeah, so real quick, we'll go over some group agreements again. Before getting into that, real quick, just a quick check. How are folks that are joining us online? Can you all hear us okay?
Sounds good to me.
Sounds good, okay. We can hear you too. Awesome. I appreciate it. So we just want to go over some quick group agreements and guidelines to help the conversation move smoothly as possible and make sure we're making space for everyone who's here in person, who's here online. So a couple of the things we like to raise up is the step up, step back. So if you're someone who finds yourself, very comfortable with sharing often, speaking often, see when you can, please share when we want to hear from you, but also see when you can, how you can practice kind of listening really intently more, practice that. And if you're someone who tends to kind of keep to themselves a little more and listen, that's cool too. No pressure to speak up if you're not feeling ready to speak up, but if you can, try and challenge yourself, maybe practice kind of sharing more, because we do want to try and hear from everyone, make space for everyone to at least be able to share. Because, while this is a teaching, and, we're sharing a lot of information, we like to look at it as like a group effort, a group practice of study together. And so, yeah, we want to hear from everyone, we want everyone to be involved. One mic, we can all talk, but we can't all talk at the same time. So if someone's speaking, someone has the floor, try and yield the floor to them, let them say what they got to say, let them finish their piece before you add on. We're studying together, like I mentioned, so let's learn from each other. Let's not be afraid to ask questions. This is a space, where we're learning together. So if there are things we don't understand, it's cool to ask questions. We're here to learn together. There's some things we might not even be able to answer today, but that's okay, because now we know what kinds of questions we need to look for answers. So, and the last one on this slide here is just generosity and grace. Let's try and, have grace with each other. We're all here, again, we came here for the purpose of learning about AFRICOM. So let's try and, have grace and make an effort, an intentional effort to hear what each of us has to say, each of us has to offer in this space. A couple more guidelines just specific to the fact that we're doing this hybrid today. If you're online, if you're not speaking, please make sure to keep your mic muted, so that, it doesn't kind of distract from what's going on for everyone else. If you'd like to speak, using the hand raising feature on Zoom is one option, or, also, maybe shooting a message if you're not familiar with how to do that. Dante introduced himself earlier, is going to be our online kind of hybrid facilitator. So they'll be making sure everything is as smooth as possible, enjoying kind of the in-person and online experience. And then for us in person, let's try and speak loud. All of us, everyone online is hearing us through that little speaker mic on that circular table in the middle of the room. So you can orient your voice kind of in that direction, but in general, just try and project And folks online, if you can't hear us, please shoot a message, say something. And Dante will let us know to speak a little louder, figure out what to do with the mic. All right, so I'll kick it to Justin to tell us a little bit about Black Alliance for Peace.
Okay, bet. Well, we'll just start off and watch this video, which is going to say a lot about it, and we'll add a couple pieces at the end.
The U.S. is birthed from savagery. Europeans committed genocide against native peoples and stole their land, all while kidnapping and enslaving native and African people to turn a profit. Now, over 400 years later, the United States is a massive empire. It has 800 military bases and at least a dozen colonies scattered across the globe. Ever since its founding, the U.S. has always been at war, and it's the only country in history to use nuclear weapons against people. At this very moment, the U.S. is engaged in at least 7 wars of occupation and regime change. The mission? To ensure U.S. businesses have access to land, resources, and cheap or slave labor. But the 1% also wages war against Black and colonized people in the U.S., just as they've done from the start. Police continue to murder, brutalize, and surveil Black people. Our communities are impoverished, starved of resources, and thrown in jail. All the while, police departments become more and more like occupying armies. And the military budget, well, it just keeps getting bigger. The Black Alliance for Peace was launched in 2017.
The Black Alliance for Peace, as an organization, committed to revitalizing the traditional anti-war positions of the Black community.
The United States is the worst abuser of human rights in the world. If you look at the invasions, the proxy wars, the sanctions.
The powers that be are seeing a threat to the status quo.
It does not matter whether the United States government agrees with Maduro and his policies, because 6 million Venezuelans wanted him to lead them. As a sovereign people, they have a right to determine their own direction and future.
Everyone has a place in this movement. We must be organized. If we want peace, we have to be willing to fight for it.
Our campaign is no compromise, no retreat. Defeat the war on African Black people in the U.S. and abroad. The campaign includes the demands to end police militarization, stop their training by the Israeli Defense Force, shut down AFRICOM, remove all U.S. military presence from Africa, defund the military, and close the 800 military bases around the world. Black people have always been the consciousness and change agents within this brutal regime. Now can be no different. We are in the heart of the empire, and we must remember our fight for liberation is connected to the liberation of Black, brown, and working class people everywhere. It is time for us to stand up to oppose U.S. war and murder and defeat the U.S., EU, NATO axis of domination. That is why the Black Alliance for Peace was founded. And that is why we need you.
Okay, great. So that is a bit about the Black Alliance for Peace, just a little bit more. The Black Socialist Formation is a member organization of the Black Alliance for Peace. They are got the name the Alliance because it's an organization of organization, although it also has individual members as well. So there's citywide alliances in Baltimore, in DC, in Atlanta, in the South, in Los Angeles, and it's just continuing to grow. It also has a solidarity network, which is for non-African people of 150 plus and more than 25 organizations. So even non-Africans are able to join the Black Alliance for Peace and join the solidarity network. We actually have 3 solidarity network people here in Pittsburgh. So that piece is starting to grow and develop. So we're hoping to develop that further. And then also hoping to see other Black organizations in Pittsburgh want to be members of the Black Alliance for Peace, because from there we might be able to actually do a citywide alliance, because you really need a few different Black-led organizations to form an alliance. So we're hoping that the point is to grow the Black radical peace tradition. And so Black radical tradition is also led non-African people. So there's that way to join as well. Yeah. Okay, this means still right. Okay, so AFRICOM is discussed here because not only because it's AFRICOM, right, but because it is a reflection of neo-colonialism, and it's really showing 2 sides of the same coin, right? So you have the military in Africa, and you have AFRICOM, and you have like more than 30 bases throughout Africa. But then in the US, we have the #2 police station right up around the corner, and both are playing very similar roles in terms of just kind of the presence having a stifling effect. If people were to get organized and want to try to do any kind of resistance, the police would be the first called to try to interject and to stop that and be right at the scene. The AFRICOM functions in the similar way, but that's a function of capitalism and imperialism. So it's not just like military, just for military's sake, or dominance for dominance sake. It's because the ruling classes need defense. Once property is established, it needs its own kind of army that goes along with it. With private property comes armies. And so we just wanted to kind of, just have it, these terms are underneath AFRICOM. And as a socialist organization, we want to emphasize that, like, the only solution to these things, from our view, is to get rid of capitalism. AFRICOM is like more so the tail than the dog. Next slide. So this is basically trying to maybe show one piece of this, and to start off, a view that one of the pieces that we've studied is the view of Black people as an internal colony, which is a different kind of socialist view, that this is like the primary contradiction is that we're an internal colony. Capitalism has constructed that, and then outside in relation, there's a white settler working class. And that really, if we were to try to overthrow capitalism, we have to overthrow the whole colonial project, which of course is very important for the land back movement, and hopefully will help us understand something like Israel, right, as also in their colonial situation. And that hopefully, and that's one of the things that BAP really tries to emphasize, right, is that, this idea of the internal colony. The next piece, so that's a bit about racial capitalism. That racial capitalism is constructing this internal colony, and that's that kind of AFRICOM-US relationship. On imperialism, one of the things that, I'll just maybe just read this one, but the ruling class is actually, would someone else read the imperialism one? Like the definition there, the middle one.
Yeah, anyone in person, anyone online,
yeah,
feel free.
I can.
Yeah.
The U.S. ruling classes use the West's underdevelopment of Africa to leverage it and extract cobalt, uranium, oil, or debt. This underdevelopment is continued with the fostering of paramilitary groups and the attack against socialist movements. These resources both help to subjugate and pay off the settler classes and the upper working classes of the Black domestic colony in the U.S.
Yeah. This is to say, like, if we're for liberation here, we have to see that the problems that we have here are made possible by the exploitation of Africa. So you don't even have to do this because you care about African people as being a good person. if they can continue to extract all these resources here, it's very difficult to defeat a group that has all that capital. So we're saying like, we want to see Africa free, even for our own struggles, because they use that for all of their military resources here. So we need to see these challenges we have here as often based on that exploitation. I mean, you want to go read the neo-colonialism one?
I can read that piece in here.
Okay.
So the African upper working class and elites partner with the U.S. ruling class in their oppression of their own countries by facilitating capital, military, and ideological access to Africa, the two legs and head of U.S. imperialism.
Yeah. One of the folks at the conference this past weekend, Chipo Sobukwe, had a great, I thought, analogy to understand what imperialism is. It has two legs: the economic exploitation and the military exploitation, and the ideological, which is the head. And so if you want to understand imperialism, it's got an economic leg, it's got a military leg, and then it's got an ideological piece. Those three things together make that possible. And then today we're going to see more of the military leg, but of course, they all end up coming together. Yeah. Any questions or thoughts about any of this? Comments online? Yeah.
Yeah, Paul had a question. What was the conference?
Oh, okay. So BAP is biannual. Every 2 years, they have a big collective conference of all the members and the individuals. And I went to it this past weekend. It was in Baltimore. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Comments? Add on to it. Okay, cool. Is there any other comments?
All said, thanks.
Oh, good bet. Okay, cool. All right.
All right, cool. Thank you, Justin.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Claire, you want to
Yes.
address the?
So, why do you think it's important for us to focus on Africa and African people? What do you think? Why are we looking at this? And what relevance does it have to us here in the United States today? What do people think? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to share one of the quotes I put in the little chat thing we have. In 2050, 1 of every 4 people will be African. 1 of every 4 people in the world will be African.
Will be on the continent of Africa, right?
They'll be African, yeah. I believe, I don't know.
No, it is that. They'll be on the continent of Africa. Someone might say we're Africans out here too, but like whenever people will be on the continent of Africa itself. Yeah.
Well, a comparison is that here in the United States today, the majority of people under 18 are people of color. And I forget the figures now, but by very shortly, 2050.
Yeah. Same number, yeah.
The overwhelming, something like 3/4 of people, of young people in this country will be people of color. And it's not just African, but many of these people have some connection to Africa. Any other thoughts or ideas about?
I think Dave, Dante.
Dr. Jameson had to share, Africa has suffered the greatest theft of wealth, human lives, culture, and resources.
Yeah.
And what does that mean for us here in the United States? Why is that important to us?
That's a question.
Dr. Coming back to you, Tyra.
Yeah.
And again, anybody can feel free to come off mute on the Zoom to share in the discussion as well. All right, so for Africans living in America, it's about reclamation and connection.
One thing I would say too, I think for us is that what would it mean to us to see, one of the people that we've studied is Kwame Nkrumah, and he had what he would talk about as a pan-African, one socialist Africa, that was federated with states. What would it mean to us to see that, right? And how do we even feel when we see the Kenya uprisings, right? What does it mean to how we would respond? Even when we would see the South African, right, struggled, how that affected us. And what do you think, what would it mean? I think it would mean quite a lot to me to see that, I would feel, yeah, I would feel like I sat different in the world.
I also appreciated on the previous slide, how you made the connection between the way like that, the wealth, the theft of wealth, and resources from the continent enables and, you know, enriches, imperial powers to then, you know, subjugate people here. And that just helped make the relationship really clearly. So, you know, you mentioned, you know, different places, Congo, Senegal, Kenya, just imagining, you know, what not only the, I guess, like emotional and like cultural importance of those struggles, but also like what material outcomes happen when imperial forces are, you know, defeated in these spaces.
Dante?
Yeah, Killian had something to share. American and Western prosperity heavily relies on African subjugation, so we have a duty to change that.
Can I add something? I mean, in the context of the United States, I think it's important because African Americans are the biggest population that they were like displaced and replaced to another continent. They were separated from the land that was exploited. And when we talk about colonization, about the exploitation of the land and exploitation of the body, but also the body is always living, residing in the land, but like separating it and like it intensifies the level of exploitation. And that's kind of, if you go back to Fanon that says that the bottom should be the top, I think that should tell us something about focusing on the bottom to get it to the top.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting from your saying that is that, just like the capitalists, the European capitalists colonized Africa and then created an African diaspora and brought them over here, separated them from their land, put them elsewhere. And see a parallel today for what's happening with the Palestinians, where they're trying to take them from their land, create a diaspora to go somewhere else. And we're never really, you moved elsewhere, but we're never really considered legitimate, never really free, because we're not really considered legitimate here. We're looked on as the other. Anybody,
Another one, the African continent is growing younger. All the other continents are growing older. Over time, Africa is moving into a clear position that will have impact for all of us, no matter where we are. And I think that's important to kind of take into consideration why we need to pay more attention to Africa than we have in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, I would just want, one other thing too, is that I think that there's a lot of practice to learn from. And there's a lot of theorizing about like what is the nature of the struggle to learn from. And so I feel like it's you know, whether it's you know, one person my daughter introduced me to is a woman named Hannah Kujo. She was an organizer for Kwame Nkrumah, but just the strategy she used to organize in Ghana, and like, you know, both her and Stephen Biko like use literacy as an organizing strategy. I just feel like, you know, we often think about protest strategies, but I feel like there's a few different African examples of using like development of people, you know, as the organizing strategy, because it's a different context. So protesting isn't always the thing. And I feel like there's a few different examples there where it's completely revolutionary strategies, but whether it's land, taking care of land, or literacy, and I feel like there's some examples there to look at, you know.
anything else?
Yeah, I'll add some. I think something like trend or thread that I've heard also so far in the conversation, deals with diaspora a lot. And I think just focusing on that a little more too, I think there's a huge importance on recognizing, the connections between African folks in all places on the globe, right? It's really important for us to focus on, right, Africa, on the continent, on the motherland, right? And just as well, I think it's also extremely important for Africans around the world who don't find themselves on the continent and maybe haven't found themselves connected to the continent for a couple of generations. For us all to see ourselves as Africans and as African people and as connected. The racial hegemony, the hegemony that, you know, we're up against that we're trying to dismantle is one that has been built upon anti-Blackness. And one of the many methods for developing it has been to create that separation, as we spoke to a little earlier, as was spoken to a little earlier. And creating that separation also makes it a lot more difficult to understand and to identify with people who share an enemy, right? Who share an oppressor with us, who share an enemy with us, who share goals with us, right? Horizons that we want to reach together. It's important for us to see ourselves as connected. And I think that's something that is important for me to remember all the time too, is just, I'm a child of African immigrants. I'm someone who was born here in this country and raised in this country. And feeling that connection and knowing that connection exists and leaning into that connection, I think is an extremely important part of how we should think about the path to liberation for Black people here in Africa, globally.
So, and that's an excellent point. And one of the things I wanted, as you were talking, I thought of, when people think about the African diaspora, they think about here in the United States, but does anybody here know where the largest African diaspora is? Sam?
Is it Brazil?
It's Brazil. Brazil. And we think we have police brutality here.
We do.
You should look, we do, I mean, but you gotta look at, you should look at Brazil.
For
I would argue, I think it's Panama.
You said, well, you think it's Panama?
But it's
In
okay.
terms of the numbers, in terms of percentage, you might be right now. In terms of the numbers, the actual numbers of Brazil. And then you're right, the Panama, and there's another country that really has a large percentage of its population that's larger than the United States too. You know, the other country besides Panama that has a even larger percentage of its population, Colombia. Colombia is like 26%.
Well, Haiti's larger than that.
What?
Haiti's larger than 20.
Well, yes, you're right.
Percent.
Haiti's like 97, 100.
That's about 96.
Yeah, so then there's Haiti, there's Colombia, there's Jamaica. Well, I think when they're talking about on the mainland of South America, but you're right.
Sure.
But you're right, in the Caribbean, it's almost all
Yeah,
for
sure.
But,
Haiti gets overlooked. I mean, there's more people, there's more Black people, there's more French-speaking Black people because of Haiti than there are English-speaking people in the Caribbean.
yes, that's true. There's other interesting things, like there's a large African population in Honduras and Nicaragua.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're just not, and there's an interesting history about the African population in Mexico. I don't have time to tell that story, but it's just fascinating.
Yeah.
That's a story of interesting struggle and of animosity between the United States and Mexico.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions or
I think we're ready to finish.
interesting statements?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks everyone. So we're gonna have another group discussion at the end of this too. We also just thought it was important before we got into more of the meat of this for us to kind of reground, recenter, refocus around like why are we here today? And this is a great question we offered in the last one. We just wanted to return to. Next, we're gonna watch this another video put together by the Black Alliance for Peace on what AFRICOM is specifically. So the video we watched earlier was kind of speaking about the Black Alliance for Peace in general and introduced AFRICOM in a part of it. But this one is put together by the Black Alliance for Peace few years back now, I think, but also does a really good job of summarizing what AFRICOM is and what that means for us.
Militarized police violence carried out against Black and other non-European colonized peoples domestically, and the brutal violence of the U.S. military and intelligence agencies abroad are two sides of the same white supremacist colonial capitalist coin. That is why for the Black Alliance for Peace, it is vital that the public understand this connection. The U.S.-made bombs bursting in air remind us that U.S. imperialism is still alive and well. The U.S. commitment to the concept of full-spectrum global dominance is carried out in many forms, including 11 command centers that are headquartered across the world. The U.S. Africa Command, or AFRICOM, puts most African states under the effective military control of the United States. The Indo-Pacific Command is the counterpart to AFRICOM in the Asia-Pacific and is being used to direct military aggression towards China. 2 years after the end of the Second Imperialist War in 1945, the U.S. established the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Center in 1947, formerly known as the U.S. Pacific Command Center. Its area of responsibility encompasses about half the Earth's surface. The 36 nations that comprise the Asia-Pacific region are home to more than 50% of the world's population. The U.S. has 375,000 enlisted members of its Indo-Pacific Command, including 60% of its Navy ships, 55% of its armies, and 2/3 of its Marine Corps. In addition, with 85,000 forward deployed soldiers and a large amount of high-tech and new weaponry, the U.S. military has maintained its absolute supremacy in the Asia-Pacific over the years, while also continuing to seek new deployments, budgets, and resources, using the threat of China's and Russia's strategic rivalry as a justification. South Korea, Guam, Australia, Malaysia, and a host of other countries have strengthened military arrangements with the United States over the last decade. In 2007, the Bush administration announced the establishment of the U.S. African Command Structure.
We're going to Benin, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ghana, and Liberia. Each of these countries is blessed with natural beauty, vibrant culture, and an unmistakable spirit of energy and optimism. Africa in the 21st century is a continent of potential.
AFRICOM, that was then fully launched on October 1st, 2008. The U.S., which currently has the largest military budget in its history, spends nearly $2 billion per year to carry out imperialism in Africa. A study by the UN concluded that in the majority of cases, state action appears to be the primary factor finally pushing individuals into violent extremism in Africa. Of more than 500 former members of militant organizations interviewed for the report, 71% pointed to government action, including killing of a family member or friend, or arrest of a family member or friend as the incident that prompted them to join a group. And the cycle continues. Drone attacks breed recruitment, which produces further terror attacks, which leave the states involved more dependent on U.S. military support. This is how the West creates the demand for AFRICOM. We must demand that the U.S. shut down AFRICOM and the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. No compromise, no retreat. No compromise, no retreat.
The independence of Ghana is not for any sale. Oh yeah. I can tell them that the good people of this country, overwhelming majority of people of this country, flatly and totally rejects this attempt to send us back into colonialism. We will never be colonized again.
Great. So, this AFRICOM, you can see the U.S. has this term called terrorists, right? Which they essentially, I would say, the ruling class uses that for anyone who has ideas opposed to them and will use arms is a terrorist. There's nobody who will use arms against them that they'll say that's a legitimate opponent, except for maybe like people who have nuclear weapons, essentially. But like anybody who takes up arms and has been doing their own is a terrorist. If they don't have a state usually, right? So, and if you don't, and I think what you'll see here is that this is how AFRICOM has been able to grow is because of this term that we'd like to emphasize more, which is Salafist jihadists, which is they're not just terrorists, right? There are people who have taken on a certain point of view that is directly related to AFRICOM itself. They're really directly related to U.S. military policy. So since AFRICOM got started in 2007, 2008, you can see a growth in the amount of jihadists in Africa. But that actually ends up becoming what the U.S. then uses as a way to then say, you need us in your country because, for example, let's say in Mali, where, you know, just in July, you had an ambush of Salafist jihadists that left some 40 people of Mali soldiers killed, as well as even some of the Russians who were supporting them killed. They're in an ongoing battle, particularly in the Horn of Africa. But a lot of those folks are using weapons that they got from Libya, right? And how did Libya end up releasing all those weapons? Because AFRICOM, the U.S., using AFRICOM as well as NATO, you know, went and overthrew and got rid of a sitting president and assassinated him in a very public way, Muammar Gaddafi. So one of the main points here that is to emphasize is when you see this issue of, oh, look at the terrorists there, is to understand that, you know, those folks, a lot of them were trained by Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda comes directly, again, out of U.S. Policies in Afghanistan, and that's right, exactly. But also even out of Palestine. Some of those folks who developed some of the doctrines there are expelled Palestinians. So it's important to see that, like, that all of that stuff that's happening or so-called terrorists are, a lot of them are direct reactions to the U.S. and in various ways. And then the U.S. then, after having helped that grow, then says to people essentially like, don't you want us to protect you? And so, because in the initial parts, you'll see I guess one last thing I'll say about this is that the base for AFRICOM is in Germany. They initially wanted to find some place to do it in Africa. That picture of that, the Ghanaian who was like talking, they said the spokesperson in the last video, that was someone who was like, you are not going to bring AFRICOM here. They were protesting in the streets against it, right? So that, I think, kind of shows that it actually was nothing that was wanted. Now today it's in 52 or 54 countries with agreements. So that is the main piece around AFRICOM, is to be aware of. It is supposedly there to help Africa fight terrorists, and because the U.S. is an interest in fighting terrorists. But if you look at the way that those forces have grown in Africa, they've grown. The longer AFRICOM has been there, so you have more. And that's why the video says a lot of people who join or who've been injured or killed, have family member killed. So it's actually kind of serving as a way to like stimulate it further. So that's just a piece around kind of like AFRICOM's underlying rationale.
And then, I'll continue from there too,
Yeah.
also to, you know, help generalize that a little bit too. Is just like, you know, acts of violence against civilian lives. Well, you know, we're talking about people who are human beings just like us, who are going through their day-to-day life just like us. Any act of violence like that against civilians is something that's very important for us to take seriously and consider, right? But the point here about terrorism is really important to understand that this term and the way to use it, it's used, serves a particular purpose to create an image, right? It's propaganda that teaches us to make associations with that term, right? And so while acts of violence, you know, we don't want acts of violence against innocent people, against civilians in general, something happens when the people who are named terrorists, who are called terrorists, are so often Black, so often brown, so often Muslim. If that is the only image that we're ever presented with and associating with the word terrorism, it does work to kind of bolster this hegemony that the West creates and solidify and teach us to internalize this image of what terror looks like and where terror comes from and who produces terror. When we look at history, we can see things that we would call terror being perpetrated by the West all throughout history and continue through today. So, oh yeah, please. Yeah, I was just gonna take us into a quick video of Burkina Faso's sitting leader right now, kind of speaking a little bit about this. But before we do, We have a comment on the.
Yes, Paul had a question, if you can answer this. What notable groups make up the Salafist jihadist affiliation, and what efforts are being done to combat Salafist jihadism?
So one will be Al Shahib, which is one in the Horn of Africa. That's probably the one that gets the most. It used to be Boko Haram in Nigeria that got a lot of attention, but now Al Shahib gets a lot of the attention that's in the Sahel region. In terms of combating it, I think, one thing that we'll probably talk more about, like Mali is partnering with Russia to try to combat it. So that's one way to combat it. But I think the part of it that's really that maybe we can talk more about is the main thing for us is it is terrible to see, on Christmas Eve, a church blown up or, that these are horrible things. But that countries would be better off being able to address these things without the US. It's like whether it's terrible or good or whatever, the main thing is we have to pull the US out of there because it's only gotten worse. It's our natural position to think that it's our role to be like, how is this going or how is that going? And the main point here is nothing gets better with the US military. And so we need to say it's terrible, but it's not helped by the US involvement.
Well, Kenya is a good example, because the US interests aren't necessarily the interests of the people. So that it's not in the interest of the people of Kenya to be sending military to Haiti.
Right.
What's in their interest is helping them have decent lives, have living wages, have health care, but the US is not in there for that.
Yeah, and I'll just say maybe one thing about this too. If you look every year, they do a posture statement, and you can watch them in March talk about what the purpose of AFRICOM is to the Senate. And this year, one of the senators asked Michael Langley, the person who is the black man who leads AFRICOM, why do we have AFRICOM? And his answer was Russia and China. So it's not even trying to portray that it's for African people. It's because going back to capitalism, that is the issue of the markets, right? We don't want Russia and China to get established there and get sway. So the military there is to prevent that. So that just gets back again to like what the Salafist jihadism is doing is stimulating it such that you cannot develop economically, right? And yeah.
We'll watch this quick little video real quick and then kind of move on from this piece, unless anyone has any other, questions, comments they want to make right now.
I did want to just chime in real quick. This conversation is, I feel like, following the war on terror in the Middle East, we see this pattern of, like you said, the way that the US involvement kind of manufactures new enemies, right? From Hamas to Al-Qaeda to the Taliban to ISIS, like every time we try to intervene, it destroys like the fabric of societies and allows like even further more extremist groups to emerge. But I feel like because our media doesn't necessarily focus as much on the ways that maybe some of these similar patterns are happening in Africa. I guess this is just really, I don't know, it just seems like there's a parallel there that is maybe helpful for me to better kind of understand how this pattern plays out.
Yeah. I gotta say, go ahead, please.
Yeah, we had another question from chat from Paul. What Pittsburgh businesses are connected to AFRICOM that can be sought to divest from, or ones that might be good to look into to find a connection?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's actually one that's come up and we don't have an answer for that. So that maybe we could throw it out to the group. Let's find an answer to that question.
Yeah. That might be one of the things we kind of want to also take away with us if we don't have an answer today, and kind of look into. I think, like Justin said, yeah, that's something we did want to try and do some looking into while we were organizing this month of action. But yeah, that's a great question, Paul.
Is there any drone makers in Pittsburgh?
I know that EMU.
EMU provides a technology company works with Ghost Dynamics. So they make that little robot dog.
They did a lot of drones there. So that would be one place to start.
The Democratic Party.
Yeah, for sure.
Comment on my question.
Oh, yeah.
One comment, I mean, of course, like terrorism, the label of terrorism is very similar label for dehumanization of people, like as enslaved people were like kind of dehumanized, or like Jews in Europe dehumanized, or Palestinians are being dehumanized now. Terrorism is a take away the humanity, so we can go ahead and kill. But I have, other than this, I have a question about the Black Socialists. Do you see the position of Black Socialists to, of course, dismantle American imperialism and American presence all over the world? You feel this is the work that you're gonna be doing, or you're kind of in solidarity with the working class people? Because sometimes I feel a group of people or a people of the land can be suppressed by their own government, but also by an imperialist state. Like both of them together, for example, as an Iranian person, I experienced living under both oppressive systems. But they are antagonistic with each other, but they're both oppressive equally almost.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say one reaction, see if anyone here has a point of view. I think here, our view, just like with Haiti, is for the US to leave.
Yeah.
It's to not actually take a position, like we're there to be like, get involved. It's like, let's get the US out, and then let the people decide how that's gonna go. We have our own struggle here that we need to actually develop. We have our own domestic colony. Part of our struggle is to get this, stop letting them get stronger from Africa. But it's not for us to become our own kind of like imperialists, where like, we need to be involved there. So it's like people will solve their own problems. If we get the US out, we have so many hell of problems right here. I think that's our view in this particular context, is our role is that we're in the imperial core. We are making that possible because it is using our tax dollars to do that. That's my sense. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with Haiti is a perfect example of that, because the people pick their leaders if they want it, RP. But the US came in, and that's what often happens, and then the US puts in people that it will meet its needs. That's what's happening in Kenya, that's what's happening in the ECOWAS nation. That's what happened when the Sahel was France, and still, it was that same thing, where the US, by being there, prevents the people from being able to have self-determination. The same thing, although Israel is the proxy for the US, but that's what's happened in Palestine. And right now, that's what they're talking about happening. When they're talking about, in the US, they're having those meetings right now, when they're talking about the future for Gaza, they're not talking about Gazans having self-determination. They're talking about, and it's the same thing all over. And when they're talking about going down and saving Haiti, they're not talking about Haitians having self-determination. They're talking about proxies, about propping up their own people, puppet regimes to have and so if we get them out, then people can fight themselves. I think people can fight themselves for what they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the question raises a complicating factor too, because when people fight back against the United States, I want to support them, even though they might be terrible in some way. Like, so there's this contradiction that we have to wrestle with. On the one hand, you see people fighting back, and you know that needs to happen, but you might not know enough about the detail of what's happening internally in any place. Like, we may not know enough, but it's like a gut reaction is you want to support the fight back. But like you're saying, there's also another fight back that might need to happen in those particular places, just like we have to do here, is we have to change the capitalist system that exists in those other places as well. But that's not our job here. Our job is to change it here. But we do need to learn more about what's happening in different places, because it's not it's not easy or cut and dry, it's complicated.
Yeah, and I think it's, you're also gonna see this in actually what Fran is gonna present, because it actually is gonna get brought up again. I'll just say one last thing in terms of the US connection, the internal colony, that I think about is the way, just in this neighborhood here, I feel like it's similar the way that young people, particularly young men, can get guns. And then the neighborhood actually wants police. Would be like, you all are very impractical people saying abolish the police because you don't live under these conditions. And so I think that then you could argue all these things come into play. But I actually think if you take away, if you throw in gang and take out terrorists, the strategy actually then looks very similar, particularly if you say, oh, what was the US role in putting cocaine in, changing prisons? You're like, oh, maybe the internal colony again gets clearer, because actually often you see Black middle class people like myself then leaving the neighborhood, right? Because with using class to escape it. So it's like, actually, it looks very similar.
Yeah, appreciate us taking a moment to talk about that. Actually, I really appreciate that point as a segue into the video we're about to watch, which is, again, this is Ibrahim Traoré, who's right now the sitting leader in Burkina Faso. And I'll say more after we watch it, but.
Regardez à travers leurs films, ils ont préparé l'esprit de leur peuple pour les faire comprendre qu'ils sont les meilleurs. C'est eux qui doivent tout posséder. Vous ne direz pas le contraire. Dans tous leurs films qu'ils propagent, vous trouverez toujours les méchants. Ce sont soit les Russes, soit les Sud-Américains, soit les Noirs qui jouent les mauvais rôles de trafiquants de drogue, de proxénètes, de trafic d'humains, jusqu'à un passé récent, bien sûr. Vous trouverez les Arabes qui jouent le rôle des terroristes. Voilà un peu comment ils perçoivent le monde. Regardez comment ils qualifient certains peuples. Par la communication, ils peuvent arriver à vous amener à faire détester un peuple ou à aimer un peuple. Ils sont très forts dans la communication et ils passent par tous les canaux possibles. Regardez les guerres qui sévissent. Ils ont tout inventé pour leur propre intérêt. Et enfin, l'empire des esclaves, selon eux, c'est l'Afrique et certains peuples d'Amérique du Sud.
So I really appreciate, Kyle kind of making this connection to the same connections that we're endeavoring to, understand and connect right here in this room right now. You see our comrades in Burkina Faso doing the same thing over there. And it kind of speaks to this point of why it's important for us to understand, right? We're here and we need to fight the battle that we have in front of us here, whether that be, abolishing the police and stopping the construction of these military type police training facilities, from what's going on here in Pittsburgh, and its relation to what's going on in Atlanta with the cop city in Atlanta, to AFRICOM, right? Because all of these things are different faces of the same machine. And it's really useful for us to be able to understand how those things connect. Not necessarily that we're gonna, pick up and travel to Burkina Faso or to Niger, to Mali to go help fight back against the West over there, but to understand that we have a connection, we have a shared goal, we have shared stakes in a sense. While they may not be the same, we do have shared stakes, a lot of shared stakes, as people fighting against imperialism, people fighting against colonialism, neo-colonialism, and ultimately, as Black socialists, we're really interested in inspecting that capitalism piece and how that is the foundation for all of that too, right? As all people struggling against capitalism, all the working people. So, that's our piece there. So for now, also, we'd like to transition into what Ibrahim Traoré and a lot of the folks in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and Niger are up to right now. We thought it'd be a great time as ever to kind of focus in on what's going on in the Sahel, because there's an example of African peoples fighting back for their own self-determination, fighting back for our own self-determination, fighting against neo-colonialism right there on the African continent. And this is in the Alliance of Sahel States. So just to go into a brief, quick little history of what's going on. If you haven't heard of the Alliance of Sahel States, already. There have been coups, military coups recently in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, where they've ousted their former neo-colonial heads of state. In Mali, it was in August of 2020. In Burkina Faso, that was in September of 2022. And Niger just had a coup d'etat last year in July of 2023, where they ousted Bazoum. And so these seizures of power is really important because in the Sahel right now, folks politically kind of given it the nickname the coup belt because of all the military coups taking place in that region of Africa. But we focus on these ones, especially because they created this alliance and because these seizures of power were all inspired by and brought about after ongoing protests, resistance, uprisings by the people of these nations, the working people of these nations, demanding change, demanding something different from what their neo-colonial leadership had been offering them in terms of quality of life, in terms of life and everything. So these seizures of power, all we'll see if you follow and you look, they're all popularly supported. The peoples and the masses in these three nations in these three territories are all heavily in support of these seizures of power, of these coups, because they've ousted these neo-colonial leaders who have been bringing nothing but suffering, nothing but a continuation of the colonial conditions that these nations have been facing already for more than decades and centuries. So shortly after Niger's coup, which again was in July of 2023, in September of 2023, those three nations, they're all bordering nations, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. They agreed to form an alliance, what is called the Alliance of Sahel States. The acronym is AES because they're all Francophone nations, and that is the acronym of the French name of the alliance. But they formed at first, in September of last year, this mutual defense agreement, and that was the alliance. And this mutual defense agreement, what that meant for them was that they would agree to assist each other in defending against this internal threat that we mentioned earlier of Salafist jihadism, as well as counter rebellion against the military governments that have taken over, taken back control from the neo-colonial leadership. And they also agreed to, as well, defend each other from external aggression from the West and from, the West, namely being France and the US, we should name, and also their allies in neighboring nations, because while the people of the neighboring nations may not be allies of the West, the leadership, the neo-colonial leadership, definitely are allies of the West. So that is what brought about this top of Roma Charter that they signed as this mutual defense agreement last year, a little over a year ago. And so since that agreement, since the coups in the three nations, and since the formation of the alliance, all throughout that time, the three nations had received a lot of pushback and repression, that all backed by the West, right? One example of that, or a couple examples of that, were sanctions that were enforced by ECOWAS. For people who are not familiar with ECOWAS, it's the Economic Community of West African States. And I'll say a little bit about that just in case folks aren't familiar with ECOWAS. ECOWAS is a regional bloc in West Africa and made up of leaders of I believe, somewhere over 10 nations. I forget what the number is now, but somewhere over 10 nations, I believe, in West Africa. And the, goal, right? The goal, at least that's promoted, that's communicated about ECOWAS, is to build some kind of regional economic solidarity between the nations in West Africa, right? But what we find though, right, because we have these neo-colonial figureheads leading so many of the nations in West Africa, in Africa in general, we find that ECOWAS actually functions to serve Western interests. And so a lot of the calls being made by ECOWAS are directly influenced by US interests, primarily by French interests. So another thing, in addition to the sanctions that were placed on Mali and Niger by ECOWAS, ECOWAS also threatened a military intervention in Niger right following that coup last year. And we saw immediately after that those those threats of military intervention were publicly supported in statements by the French President Emmanuel Macron and by the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. So then we see evidence of the way it's very clear that the West is calling the shots and saying, you know, hey, we're not, you know, the West is not happy at all about the fact that power was seized from these neo-colonial figureheads that were leading these three nations. Oh, were you about to say something?
Well, maybe I just don't.
Well,
Well, okay, what I was gonna say, for those of you who aren't interested, why the heck would the West care about this? Well, Niger has one of the biggest uranium, amounts of uranium in the world. And Mali, and all three of these countries, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, are resource rich, and some of the resources that we now make our cell phones and so on. In fact, the joke is about Niger, that Niger, the uranium from Niger lights 1/3 of the light bulbs in France. Yet more than half the people in Niger, I think like 80%, don't even have electricity. So they have this, so they have these resources that are not. This is why this is why people rebelled, because people were looking at it and saying, hey, we have all this wealth, and we don't have electricity, but we are lighting up France. So that law is that, but I just so people can understand what's going on here.
yeah, really appreciate that point, because it's important to understand like a little more deeply what these interests are, right? So it is very convenient that the US is placing these military bases, and you know, the Western France as well, is placing these military bases in, they always seem to find this terrorist threat somewhere where there is an economic interest for the ruling capitalist class, right? So anywhere there's oil, anywhere there's gold, anywhere there's uranium, anywhere there's
Now cobalt.
there is some reason why, coincidentally, the US needs to have troops in this place, or needs to have some kind of military presence or military influence in this region. The last thing I'll just mention too, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go, one thing when you're doing the slide, one thing I had, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so the last thing I'll mention on this slide too is just, pretty recently as well, a Ukrainian military intelligence spokesperson, I think either released, I think made a statement, and then someone in their department also might have released some kind of tweet on the official
Facebook, yeah.
on the Facebook post on the official Facebook, suggesting that it played a role in supporting some of the rebel forces in northern Mali. After this is, you know, during Mali being taken over from neo-colonial leadership. And so again, we, you know, mentioned the Ukraine piece because Ukraine is a nation also heavily backed by and right now heavily influenced by the West, by the US especially.
So when that refers to rebel forces, those are rebel forces that are against the Sahel states, or?
Yes, thank you. That's a great question, so appreciate that. Yeah, these are rebel forces that are against this military junta that's running Sahel, that's running these nations in Sahel now. Running Mali, Mississippi.
Right, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Those are jihadists. Well, yeah, in the northern part of Mali, you'll see that a lot of the cities are in the southern part, and then there's a lot of rural in the north. And there's a lot of that's a lot of the battle. There's a lot of the jihadists up there. You know, one thing I'll just add to this is that in 21, Western finance, US being most of it, was loaning almost 7 billion to ECOWAS. So you can imagine a call from the US would get taken very quickly. And that's the whole thing with the neo-colonialism, right? It's that you don't need necessarily, military is there, but you also have finance. And those two things, that's those two legs of economic and finance, those two legs walking, you know.
Another thing, in fact, I'll just say it's like this, because I think the military base in Niger is the biggest base, US military base.
We're gonna go through that.
Is there any, in Sahel, like, what is the, religious makeup, or are there other, similarities and differences between the leaders there?
Good question. I'm not sure I know about the religious makeup specifically. I don't know, Justin, you?
No,
Not have to comment on.
Yeah. Same here, yeah, not enough to
Probably
cover.
a combination of Islam, like Muslim and Christian,
Absolutely, yeah.
like Nigeria.
Clearly they have enough to combined interests. I was just curious if that was like relevant to the conversation at all.
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I'm gonna consider thinking about more, looking into more.
Well, I don't know if it is in this case, but I do know that one of the things the US likes to do is go into countries and where people have lived together, like Iraq's a good example, Lebanon. I shouldn't just say the US, the West, and get people fighting against each other based on their religion, and based on separated, like the Sunnis versus the Shia in Iraq, and Lebanon, it's all divided up. That's Western doing. Christians and Jewish, I mean, that's one strategy to divide. I don't know if they're doing that. In those times.
They definitely have, throughout, the colonial history. Yeah. Welcome. Yeah, so moving forward from this, talking a little bit about how these folks in the Alliance for the Sahel States, the Alliance of the Sahel States have fought back and took steps against this repression. One example is this past January, the three nations announced a joint withdrawal from ECOWAS. They had formerly been ECOWAS member nations, and they announced a withdrawal from ECOWAS, stating specifically that ECOWAS was under the control of foreign powers and so could not be making decisions for the welfare of the masses of Africans in West Africa, and especially not in the Alliance of the Sahel States in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. So that's one big step, was leaving ECOWAS and exit from ECOWAS. In August, this past August, they called on the UN to take action against Ukraine for the support of rebel troops that we mentioned on the previous slide, in a very heated address at the UN. And then one more thing, again, kind of bringing us back to this conversation about US military presence on the continent. The AES has expelled all French military forces from the territory. So all French military troops and, their former French colonies, right? So it makes sense that the French military had a huge presence there, and was able to have such a huge military presence there, and also makes sense why the AES immediately expelled the French military forces from their territory. But also Niger is the first of them to expel US military forces as well, which is AFRICOM, which is what we're talking about today. And this includes the shutdown of the largest drone base on the continent, which is what Claire was just mentioning. So just focusing a little more on that too. So this past March was when Niger made that announcement to end all military cooperation with the United States. And so they had a plan, I believe, to have all US troops pull out of Niger by September. And it actually finished early. The US troops pulled out of Air Base 101, which is in Niger's capital in Niamey, and I think it's also connected to the airport there in Niamey. That was in July. All the troops pulled out of there, and then the biggest Air Base 201, all the U.S. troops pulled out of there by early August, and so there are no more, or as as we're to understand it, there are no more U.S. AFRICOM military presence in Niger, in the territory of Niger now. A little more about that base there. The U.S. spent around, I think, $110 million on its construction, or taxpayer dollars on constructing an air base, a drone base in Niger. And I think it actually went over budget from what was agreed upon and understood by Congress when the decision was made to construct it. And it has been a major operation, base of operations for AFRICOM in this area of Africa, in the Sahel. So we're going to watch this quick little video of a congressman kind of grilling General Langley, who heads up AFRICOM, about this disagreement with Niger.
March 16th, 2023, Secretary Blinken calls Niger, quote, a model of resilience, a model of democracy, a model of cooperation. 1 year and 1 day later, Dr. Wallander, the spokesperson of the Nigeri military, Colonel Amadou Amabrame, says, quote, "The American presence in the territory of the Republic of Niger is illegal." A year and a day after our government said they were the model of resilience and democracy, they are throwing us out by the scruffs of our neck. And so, is it safe to say that this failed, General Langley?
It's safe to say that there's no correlation or causation of U.S. training to a coup happening.
Well,
period.
I mean, we've spent more than 500 million in the country. What can you say we've got for that 500 million as we sit here today?
There was a buy down on an insurance policy for protecting the homeland.
Okay, but General Langley, you went to Niger and you went to have a meeting with the people we trained who overthrew the democratically elected government, and Fox News is reporting that you didn't even get a meeting with the principal decision maker. Is that right?
I had a meeting with my counterpart.
Well, here's the quote. Sources say last week's meeting with the junta was extremely difficult. The administration's envoys did not get to meet with Niger's principal decision maker. Is that a true statement or is that a false statement?
My responsibility is to meet with my counterpart, not.
I would just hope that if
not
we're
political
training
officials.
issue leaders, we could at least book a meeting, you know, since it's the model of democracy.
So I think that video is also just a kind of an excellent demonstration of kind of how this whole neo-colonial dynamic is structured and function. How we have a Black general leading this AFRICOM mission right now, and how angry decision makers in the U.S. government are when things don't go according to the interests of the ruling class, right? Paying very close attention to this comment about military personnel that the U.S. trained taking back power to control their own nation was just such an infuriating thing, especially because U.S. Money was spent and invested, right? Because investment was being made in developing this U.S. military presence in Niger. And it was such a huge base of operations for AFRICOM. Oh yes, please.
I was going to say, I think it's worth it to look online to read the agreement between Niger and the U.S. It's like 4 or 5 pages. If you want to see something outrageous, it's outrageous how they talk to Niger. And part of the problem there was that they arrived there like a day before and was like, we want a meeting with like no notice. And they create the arrogance helped to tip that situation over. Because he arrived like, I'd like a meeting tomorrow. They're like, I'm sorry, who is you? Like, how did you like arrive like this and demand this meeting with us? But if you read the agreement, it's amazing that agreement lasted 10 years. But it also reminds me when we did a community benefits agreement here, and we were trying to talk to the Penguins, the way they openly talk to you like you're nothing, that agreement's it's a worthy read. You can look it up, it's right online.
Thank you. So, that happened throughout the course of this year, that Niger expelling AFRICOM, which is, again, for our purposes today, just something to be valued, to be watched and paid attention to. We also have.
Yeah, I just want to say something about what Justin just said. This has been a problem for the U.S. going and on the African continent in general, not just with the Sahel States. They roll in like we are going to tell you what to do, who to meet with. And I forget what country's leader was that said this. This wasn't herself. And she said, no, she said, who built this runway that you landed your plane on? China. Who wrote this building that you're meeting with us in? China. What have you given us? You've stolen our lands, stolen our fields, stolen our resources. She says, you have your nerve to talk to us like that. We're not putting up with this crap anymore. Well, I put it nicely, but not. But but the U.S. just goes to show you the level of racism and just disdain for people that you go into other countries like that. But go ahead, okay.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Wow. So just kind of moving again a little further to closer to recent times. This past July, the Alliance of Sahel States announced the decision to become a confederation. So this is a big step past, a big step beyond having a mutual defense pact or mutual defense agreement, where they say, if you touch one of us, we're all gonna, come together to the defense. This is committing to that, but also committing to cooperating around education within the 3 states, cooperating to building and developing infrastructure throughout the 3 states, to developing the economies and building up the economies of the 3 states, working together, right? And to do so, working on public health initiatives for the populaces of these 3 states. A confederation is just one step before becoming a federation, which would make the alliance one full state. And that's something that a lot of people on the ground in the Alliance for Sahel States are actually calling for right now. But the confederation, even in and of itself, where they still retain their respective governments, but commit to working together around all these different angles, holds huge significance for Pan-Africans, especially. We talk about AFRICOM, we talk about what happened in Libya, which maybe we don't need to, we can kind of, come back to that at some other point. But the idea of a unified Africa is a huge, huge, huge threat to ruling class interests in the West. And so this alliance between these states, people are hoping it grows to incorporate more neighbor states over time, to inspire the people of different nations surrounding the Sahel, the Alliance of the Sahel States, to kind of rise up and throw out their neo-colonial leadership as well. Please, question.
Just a question. So are the Sahel states, like, what is their relationship to Russia and China?
So their relationship, when they speak about Russia and China, I think when they speak about Russia, they speak about it in a real camaraderie with Russia and China, or at least I know specifically with Russia. And they work a lot with Russia and China instead of working with the West. I think coming from this angle of, the West were our colonizers. France has been our colonizer. The US has the same kind of colonial interest that France has had. The West in general has been colonizing Africa for most of recent history, recent being, centuries, right? So decades and centuries, so they're working with Russia to, they've been working with Russia along these lines in developing their infrastructure, especially economic initiatives to develop what's going on with AEF.
I asked it just because I do feel like there's a narrative that China is also a colonial force in Africa.
So in some ways, it's more complex. That same person I told you that said to the US, who built it. So my understanding from what I've been reading, I've been looking a lot after things. The US rolls in, it wants your land, it wants your resources, it takes it. It throws people off their land, and then it sanctions the government if it doesn't get rid of healthcare and safety nets and things like this. And I'm not saying that China's wonderful, but China's smart enough to say, okay, we would like some of your resources, but what do you need? We'll give you this in return, the roads, and we'll give you half instead of saying just taking it all. Now, that's not to say that there aren't problems in China, with China, but, and also they've forgiven way more loans. Usually what happens when these countries can't pay back their loans to the West is they, just like what happens to you if a loan you're having trouble, you get it restructured, you're actually worse off. You're paying more. A bankruptcy, but China has been willing to forgive, I forget a certain percentage, and it's also been willing to decrease the interest. And China has its own goals too, I'm not to say that. But as this person said, she says, we're looking at the 2 different deals, and it's not that we're saying, but who gives us the better deal? And so far, that's what's making these countries go with it. Because they're looking at who gives them the better deal and who's giving them the better deal. Because the US comes in with the big military, we're gonna force you to give us all our stuff. I was listening to a thing about, I guess Bolivia would have the biggest lithium. It wasn't like, what can we do to go in? Can we share some? Can we help each other? It was like, hey, we're coming in to take it. And it's that kind of thing, it's that full spectrum dominance thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, especially
Yeah.
thank you for that response. I appreciate it. And I think one more thing I'd add to that too is just coming back to, take another comment on this side. Oh, yeah. Coming back to, a point that I think Justin made a little earlier too is something that's important to us here in this hybrid room, right? Is right. Perhaps our interests right now isn't trying to decide what the meaning of like Chinese or Russian influence and involvement in the development of the Alliance of Sahel States is. While it's still important to think about and understand and consider, something that is important for us too is also to say, well, what we want is for the people of these nations, of these lands, to be able to make their own decisions for themselves. And that's like a really important kind of takeaway I think we'd like for today. So it's really important to understand that folks cannot make decisions for themselves. These states cannot have self-determination, cannot decide what happens with their land, cannot decide what happens with their people, with a U.S. military presence involved on their land, making calls, calling shots to make sure that they are, extracting all of the resources they can and leaving these lands and these nations with nothing in return for it. Because leaving them with nothing in return for it, leaving them disempowered is the easiest way to keep that mechanism alive so that the ruling class can keep extracting these resources. So yeah, and again, that's why this holds a huge Pan-African significance for us when we're looking at this, right? Because this is three states that have decided, no, we're gonna kick you out. We don't want France here and we don't want the US here. Sorry, we had it.
I was just wondering if you know the Confederation will be ending the franc, like the use of the franc across their states? And like, if so, would they create their own internal acting currency like Gaddafi had wanted to do? Or would they join with like the capitalist organization like BRICS and kind of risk entrenching themselves there?
I think there have been conversations about it, but I'm not sure that they've come to a decision or announced a decision about a currency switch yet. But there are some folks who believe that, they hope that they join BRICS. And I think there's some folks that, have other opinions, maybe about them creating their own currency, but I cannot remember if I've seen anything about the Alliance of the Sahel States developing their own currency yet. But I know that that's something that will be largely important for them to be focusing on right now. And in the near future or the mid future or long future, it'll be an important switch.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question because so much of their money is tied up in French banks. And that thwarting their ability to do certain, that's an excellent.
Yeah. It's a question too, because how would you even get the money out, right? Like it's in French banks. I mean, it's like, that's a question, you can't just change the paper. You know what I mean? Just for folks who aren't clear, France actually has, some, agreement that like how at the credit union, you can only borrow, like, if you want to borrow 2,000, you have to like leave 500 or something like that, like they have here, they make you put collateral on your loans. Well, everyone does, but here it's, anyway, if we could build collectively, I'd appreciate it, but what is the relationship? France has a certain agreement online as well, that it's a certain amount of money they hold of the Sahelian states, right? They're holding almost maybe half, like does anyone know the exact makeup of that?
I think it's 50% of the money in the nations
Yeah.
is held in French banks in France.
Right, yeah.
Partially in gold.
Right.
In gold, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a tough one there.
And that's another, you talked about these two legs in the head, and that's another way we see that military leg and that economic leg kind of keeping in stride with each other, right? So if France is holding all of their money or half of their money, right? France has a huge influence on what they're able to do with their own money. Yeah, go ahead.
No, finish it out.
I think that was really it, yeah.
I was gonna say.
No, I just want to ask a question. I heard you mention Christian and Muslims. I just wonder how much influence the Catholic Church has as well.
I think that's a great question. I think opens up a lot of,
You know, because the Catholic Church goes way, way, way back. And, since the Roman Empire days and so on. So I was just wondering that for myself, how much they have and how much they're in the background.
Yeah, I was looking at the other question. These are things I think to continue to study. I think partly the whole notion of the month of Africa is to really ask us to put this year round, to actually start to really include this policy in Africa, and for us to generally, like BAP has a newsletter that's every, it's every 4 to 6 weeks comes out. It's like a newsletter on Africa. But to think about this, one thing I think that comes up, this is another question maybe, that we can, talk about is, when we go into groups, is that, as an internal colony here, what we wanted to say, we want BRICS to be another competitor. Like, yeah, it may be a capitalist formation. We can also explore the Chinese relationship, and is that, not at all socialist or whatever. We can get into that piece, but like going back to, how Africans escaped from enslavement when the North and the South were fighting, and how the non-aligned movement, African people were trying to use the Cold War, and we're using that as a strategy. And so, but the challenge becomes like, if we openly say that, then we had the Uhuru 3 this summer charged as wanting to be agents of Russia. So it really quickly comes home that if we openly say we want that internal content becomes very clear, because then it's like, oh, you're acting on behalf of a foreign body, right? So it really, it gets right in the room real fast.
Yeah, I just think another thing to like try to look with a socialist lens. So what we're looking at is people fighting for independence, like to kick out the colonialists, the imperialists.
Yeah.
But that doesn't resolve the other contradictions in the country in terms of what's happening in terms of the people. It's not a socialist thing. So in a lot of places and a lot of times, there's this discussion about a transition towards socialism, which sometimes takes forever. Because you can get to this stage where we're at here with AES, but it's hard to really move to the next stage because that requires a different kind of struggle among the people and political education. So it's hard to just have a small clique of folks establish socialism because it's, it'll still, we have this other thing in our brains. The capitalist thing is in all our brains. But this thing about stages towards socialism or towards a system that can meet the needs of all the folks, especially when you're surrounded by capitalism. So they're going to be surrounded. It's going to be so hard to make that next move. And it's definitely not going to happen soon. So they have to last for a long period of time fighting off the imperialists and trying to keep it from coming back internally inside the Confederation or whatever. But I mean, that's like from a socialist lens, there's another step that we're not talking about in the main at this point, because this is the liberation struggle. There was this thing about countries want independence, nations want liberation, people want revolution. And those are three different struggles that sometimes interact with one another.
And sometimes interact with each other in negative way.
Yeah.
And the capitalists can get in there and try to play each side off of each of those struggles off of each.
They're in there now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have
question online? Or you guys done?
I want to say something, but you go.
No, you go, please. No, we've heard from you, please.
Talking about BRICS, and that comes back to my question. I don't want to bring that up, and we can have one-on-one conversation later anytime, if possible. But again, like you said, Black Socialists want to focus on America, but now you're talking about BRICS because these newly liberated countries want to join BRICS. But then Sam mentioned about like BRICS being a capitalist. I mean, to me, imperialism is, as Lenny mentioned it, is the combination of capitalism. And all capitalist countries that exist, almost all countries in the world, are potentially imperial. Like even like a country like Iran is a colonial country and is an imperial country, and I can lay that out if needed. So BRICS, putting aside South Africa because I don't have enough knowledge of that, Brazil, India, China, and Russia are all colonialist and imperialist countries right now as we are speaking, and around their own countries, within, inside of their countries, and also in other places like in Africa and in the Middle East, of course. So that was my question was that instead of, I'm generally very skeptical of any state. I'm not an anarchist, but I'm a socialist that I'm grappling like what kind of state can be possible. Because state immediately comes with the police and military, like the whole idea of hierarchy, and becomes capitalist. So again, like the question is like, what kind of people we wanna align with? Like if we're talking about people in Niger or other countries, like as like socialists, I see myself always going and finding out who is fighting against private property, who is fighting against capitalism. Doesn't matter where they are. I fully understand the danger of the U.S. imperialism or U.S. military inside of the country and having bases. But I'm not sure like going towards like Russia and China is the solution because they've been in Iran and we experienced Russia and China for the past 40 years, you know, so we know it really well and it's no better than the US. I just want to say like BRICS is not an alternative because they say that clearly that we need a world of multipolar imperialists, basically. Mm-hmm. So they say we have to diversify imperialism, basically. You know, they don't say that we have to get rid of imperialism or capitalism. They say that we need more polars. Sorry for talking.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll just say one thing that I think that we could build out further, but I think it's here for why support this, right? And I think it's because they are, you can see the way Niger has kicked out AFRICOM and the fact that they are aligning with each other, that's a shared view, right? And that they're against the French, right? So for us, I think that we have a clear alignment with them about this issue that we don't want AFRICOM there, it shouldn't be there, and you feel the same. So I think we have shared agreement about that, right? And I think that's one thing. The second thing I think is a broader question, right? But I do think on the socialist perspective, or the socialism's perspective, right? Because it's not a socialist perspective, and we get into a lot of fights because everybody wants to claim the socialist view. So I would just say, I think another view, and the view that I think maybe that Marx would offer, like the nationalist struggle is really important. Then we might fight the class struggle after that. But we support self-determination of nations because it's going to take away from the imperialists. So I think that it's fair to make that the number one primary. I think it's a fair argument to say, first, support national struggles. There's going to be another struggle after that one, like to your point. But if you're looking for the class struggle while a nation's not free, it's missing something, right? So I think it's fair to argue. We don't know where they're going right now, but those are struggles of national liberation, and we support them. But on the AFRICOM question, I think we can clearly see they are reacting a lot to the jihadist situation that the US has used to destabilize them and is using AFRICOM on. So I think on the very narrow piece of the AFRICOM issue, I think we agree about that. Then we have socialism conversations about like, well, what's our theory about that? But I think on this one here, we can resolve that one on that level.
Yeah, I'll say, yeah. I hate to cut it short. I do want to move us along. Oh no, we'll take this comment too. Actually, yeah, please first.
I guess the short version of this comment is the same way, like when I said the question of like, where do you follow, like after, like after after the US is pushed out, instead of maybe aiming toward something like BRICS. I mean, this might be a little bit woo, but the same way that you would follow the money to the end, so you would follow the money, you would follow it being sold, the weapons are sold, and like the culture of occupation, and knowing who to align with, I would argue that you would follow culture. You would follow the folks that are preserving indigenous ways of being and that are preserving like autonomy, like national and connected autonomy. And I think that that's like a pan-African belief is that balance of autonomy and preserving like the indigenous origin and the culture and also having it meet like where we are now and who we are now. Culture is so important. I think there was someone I really admire had tweeted that probably like the most unspoken theft or transfer of wealth out of from Africa and from African people is culture. Is like always because it's become stolen and capitalized off of. So that's what I got.
Appreciate that. Appreciate the conversation we all just had too, because I think it's important to be able to complicate what we're learning about and studying together, especially as a group that's committed to studying around socialism and nationalism and pan-Africanism and Black feminism and more than that too. That covers a couple of bases, but it's really important for us to be able to say to do both at once, right? To be able to support when we see people's fighting for their own self-determination against our shared enemy, against the West. And it's also important to be able to get together in spaces and like discuss, okay, what does that vision for the path forward look like? What does the future actually look like potentially for us? And that's something we hope to do more in the space a lot more. So just want to say I really like appreciate and acknowledge like the exchange we just had right now, because I think that's just a huge part of at least the theoretical talking piece of like thinking about a future towards liberation and away from US domination, away from Western domination of the world. So yeah, just to move us along since we're kind of running against the clock, I want to check in real quick. Dante, anybody on the online got any comments or anything? Or?
Not at the moment. Anybody online got any comments?
I think we're good. All right. Thank you. Appreciate you. All right. Yeah. So just to move us along too, could you put the presentation on time? Thank you. Yeah. So just wanted to talk about a couple, and this doesn't even cover all of some of the positive developments in the AES since its establishment. But just to name a few, a lot of the nations within the AES and the AES as a whole has been regaining control over the mineral resources of the land. So this includes Burkina Faso recently nationalizing 2 gold mines that were previously owned by Western mining companies. This includes Niger revoking its uranium mining license from the French company Urano. Claire mentioned earlier about how Niger's uranium has been powering so much of France. So it's in such a tragic irony, right? That I think what's been said is, the uranium in Niger lights up France while Niger is in the dark, I think is what I've heard. So, that's a big step, revoking that uranium mining license. Niger has also nationalized its water, expelling the French company that had privatized it. And Mali has nationalized the gold mine as well. And that gold mine formerly had been owned by between a South African firm and a Canadian firm, 40% each. And then only 20% was owned by Mali. So Mali is now nationalized and taking control of that whole gold mine. In terms of some economic development, infrastructure kind of related things, Mali has begun the construction of what will become Africa's largest solar power plant, which is a huge development, and hopefully as they see that project through, will hold a lot of benefits for the region and for Africa as a whole. Burkina Faso has also welcomed this project by a Moroccan group, CMAF, which I believe describes itself as a pan-Africanist with a pan-Africanist mission as well, but to construct a calcium clay production and solar power plant. So yeah, and then some cultural developments, just one to name. This was pretty recently put out by some folks who've been involved in African Stream, which you've seen some of the videos kind of provided have been from African Stream. We can talk about them a little bit later. But Niger has renamed a lot of streets and monuments that formerly were named after colonizers, named after French colonial figures, and has renamed them after some prominent Pan-Africanists in the region. One of them, I think, definitely Thomas Sankara. I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe Chibo Bakari, but yeah. So those are some of the just a few of the positive developments since the establishment of the AES. Speaking a little bit again as a socialist group, just speaking a little bit about like socialism in the Alliance of the Sahel States. While I don't think it describes itself, that alliance, as a socialist alliance, it's definitely largely inspired by socialist and Pan-Africanist politics, largely. And they've been present in that region for a long time. Some examples, socialist Mali, which Mali was led by Modibo Keita from 1960 to 1968 by a socialist government. Socialist Burkina Faso, led by Thomas Sankara, who just mentioned earlier, who was the former, well, it's said there in Burkina Faso, but Thomas Sankara led Burkina Faso for about 4 years until his assassination. And the Salva Party, while I'm not sure that there was a socialist Nigerian government, there was a huge presence, a huge socialist presence via the Salva Party that was formed in 1954 in Niger and led by Chibo Bakari. And then something else to mention, I'm not sure what the case is for Niger and for Mali, but many of the leaders right now in the current sitting leadership of Burkina Faso are also socialists and have a history of socialism and Marxist study and organizing. One of them, in fact, I believe the prime minister was actually a part of Thomas Sankara's government, socialist Burkina Faso government in the 80s. And I believe it was under that rule that the name of Burkina Faso was created too. I don't believe it was called Burkina Faso before Thomas Sankara and that took power. I believe it was the Upper Volta or something like that. You know, one of those regional names that just describes where France is stealing its resources from. And you know, the name Burkina Faso was given to the nation. The nation was named Burkina Faso during this socialist government leadership.
Upright man.
Say that again.
The translation was upright man.
Upright man. Okay, thank you.
Some of the regional dialects.
Yeah. The translation of Burkina Faso, right? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Upright man. All right. Yeah. So that, you know, that's just giving us a snapshot of a little about what what might be useful to know too about some of socialism's role. There are also socialist organizations. This is not just in the past thing. There are plenty socialist organizations and plenty socialist, Marxist, anti-capitalist presences in the Alliance of Sahel States right now. And so those might be some of the folks on the ground in the Alliance of Sahel States that are having these same very discussions about, do we want the alliance to join BRICS or not? Do we want us to create our own currency? Those are the kinds of conversations that folks are having among themselves right now in the Alliance of the Sahel States. Something we just wanted to shout out to as well is there was quite a bit of what we know about the Alliance of Sahel States that was very neatly and very clearly organized by an Africanist socialist group in Burkina Faso right now, who's been doing a project of political education in the Alliance of Sahel States, and also kind of publicly. I think some folks who are involved in organizing the Thomas Sankara Center have also been involved in African Stream, which mentioned it briefly earlier, but has recently, as of I think this in last year, in recent times, has been having a huge social media presence and just media presence in general in presenting news about what's going on in the Sahel and what's going on in Africa from an imperialist perspective specifically.
Which is why the Meta banned demonetized Africa's team.
Yep, has been demonetized.
Yeah.
So you can't find the African Stream account on Instagram anymore. You can't find it on Facebook, but they're still on Twitter. You can find some of their concept there.
They said about at least a little bit more than half of their stuff they still have, the other stuff.
Oh, yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's a great point. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that. Well, this happened to some US folks too. Who's the US group who just lost all their Google data? It really matters. So it definitely is like, don't put, make sure it's backed up, because like they lost a lot of information. But some other really important organizations lost the entire databases.
Yeah.
Google deleted the entire drive.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember too, yeah.
Yeah, they just came out with a list of all the left organizations that are on this list, and they're trying to work through like who the organization is, who's their fiscal sponsor.
Yeah.
Like that's all on this.
And this isn't Trump, this is under the Democrats.
Well, they're all
They're all together. That's what I'm trying to say, people are trying to tell you, all Trump.
But
this is both.
they have a list and they're making it, and they're starting to move on a few groups now.
Yeah.
And it could be more groups in the future, but I guess they're testing it out.
1,000%.
And they're starting with the littlest, with the less popular, I shouldn't say necessarily littlest. Well, they just arrested, it was in England, but it's still all in cahoots. Well, they didn't arrest, they just went into the house of, one of the, everybody familiar with Electronic Intifada?
Yeah.
They just, what's his name?
Stanley.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah, with all the
They just
people.
went in and took all this stuff.
Wow.
Yeah, everything, took all this stuff.
Lincoln talked about Africa Stream like on live television at a press conference.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm trying to think if there's a way we can get on, I did this when they banned RT and, well, that's another story. But there's a way you can get on, you have to get on, I forget what it's called, you get a different VPN, yeah. There's a way.
Yeah, it's gonna be important that we do develop ways of dealing with that possibility.
Yeah.
Thank y'all, appreciate that. Just want to, again, just move this along.
Yeah.
Bringing it back to the Thomas Sankara Center, just wanted to shout them out. Yeah, I want to kind of follow what they do and a lot of the useful information they put out. That's on Instagram. You can follow them at Burkina Books. But also really hugely important, if you want to support some of their efforts around political education in the Alliance for Sahel States, they're building a Pan-African library, in Burkina Faso. They're building one up in Niger as well. That's another project that they started more recently. And just in general, trying to do the work of Pan-Africanist consciousness raising, Pan-Africanist political education within the Alliance of Sahel States. And beyond just supporting, their work, the other significance it holds for us again is because a lot of that work is connected to what we're doing here. What we've all come together to do here today is also to study around AFRICOM, study around anti-imperialist politics, to study what AFRICOM is, why we demand the US leaves Africa and as many bases all over the world, and what it means for us as people living within the belly of the beast. So if you want to support their work, you can check them out there. And then, it finally brings us to this group discussion. We're right now at 8:03. So as the time check, we're a little out of time. So I'm not sure if folks are, how we feel about, not sure what we want to do in this case. So we want to spend like 10 minutes kind of talking about this.
Yeah, there is 10 minutes.
Yeah, okay.
Can I just say one thing real quick about this last slide that you gave and the whole thing you said? Thank you for all that work on AES. That was great to see like what they're doing, and I really appreciate learning that. I think part of the thing is about supporting those is that we could do, it's important that we do things like people protest the Congressional Black Caucus, right? People are doing things like doing banner drops, but they're fighting AFRICOM and have the material power to throw them out. So I think it's really important to see like that's where the edge of that is. And so supporting those countries might be the most effective strategy to get rid of AFRICOM because they've thrown out, last year there was 53 out of 54, now it's 52. Chad is thinking about it now. So rather than thinking like a US centered strategy, like we're gonna do it just all with mass mobilization, those three, if they go to 5, could be the fastest way to get rid of AFRICOM. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, folks, you know, we did, I think, schedule this for like around the 6 to 8 kind of thing. So folks need to exit. Please don't feel pressure to stick around any longer than you're able to. That goes for the folks online too. But if it's okay, just we'd like to spend some 10 minutes just doing some reflection as well. And if possible, if we could break into some small groups and talk. I think at least maybe we want to split between in person and online, just so folks kind of have a little more of a small, intimate kind of to kind of discuss, reflect on what we've been talking about. We have some discussion questions up. But is that cool? Anyone? We good?
Yeah, I have one question, Frank. What do you think about just having a group discussion, but just letting it be like whatever you want? We have these questions as possible choices, but if you have other points you want to raise, you could just raise those points, or do you want to go through those questions?
No, please. I think that was the intention with these.
Okay,
too.
cool.
These are some food for thought questions. If you can try to.
I think we should stay in one group though.
I think we should stay in one
They
group.
stay with the online group as well? Okay.
Yeah, well, why don't we do that then? Yeah, let's
We'll stop sharing the screen and then we just see what folks are at.
yeah.
Oh, we're sharing the screen, so we have the questions up, but
Okay.
yeah,
It'd be nice to see them. Can we see them at all?
they have the cameras off.
Oh, they all have their cameras off. Okay, all right, cool. Okay.
All right, yeah, so here's some questions, like Justin was suggesting. This, you know, Tom, we got anything we want to kind of jump back to, kind of reflect on from the presentation, talk about? But some questions for us to think about for the group discussion. Just what does AFRICOM tell us about the US? What does that relationship tell us about ourselves too, and just kind of our role in everything? In what ways do we see capitalism, imperialism, militarism working against us here in the belly of the beast in the US, in Pittsburgh specifically even, or wherever folks are joining us from, if it's not Pittsburgh? And what does a truly liberated Africa look like? What does that mean to us? What does that mean for us? So those are just some questions, again, like offered just as kind of angles we can take at reflecting on everything we spoke about today. But also any other comments on the session in general, on what we've studied, learned together today, are welcome. Yeah, anyone, feel free to jump in, raise your hand, whatever you want to do.
Yeah, I just think this whole concept about a United States of Africa with one military, one currency, all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of discussion in different parts of Africa about that. That still doesn't solve the socialist question. And it might be it might be necessary for that to happen first before the socialist thing can really last, because any one part of Africa that moves to socialism will be totally surrounded. And it would be more easy to pick off one nation state or one country as opposed to the whole continent. But I'm not sure what that means. Like, I'm not saying that it's more likely that each smaller countries will become socialist, but like you showed on the slide, that's happened already in a number of different places, but not able to sustain long enough or be strong enough to continue to last in Africa, at least. But I don't know what that means, but I do know there are some of the Pan-African attempts more towards a unified socialist Africa eventually, but what stages you have to go through to try to get there is not really clear. What's the strategy on how to make that move? So federation is a step towards that, maybe, but it could grow. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
So thank you so much for that amazing. I learned so much.
Appreciate everyone, you know, showing up, coming together. to study together. That's what, you know, that's kind of the project of the Black Socialist Study Group, and a huge part of what the Black Socialist Formation is up to too, is just trying to get us together, speaking, not just, and not only letting it end right at anti-imperialism, but not letting it end at, you know, this is what racism is, this is what capitalism is, this is what colonialism is, and imperialism, but also taking that next step in coming together to vision about a future forward, and just one of those potential futures forward being a socialist future, one that is directed by the working peoples, by the masses. That's yeah, please just that.
I was going to say Mr. Redwood's point, because I think it has local implications. The idea of we'll do this and then get socialist. I think that leads to sometimes being like, well, we don't have to talk about socialism today. And I think that's a mistake. Not that you're necessarily saying that, but I think that because even if you got to be one country, the process to do it might make for people who will defend that country more than a group that's like, what do I care? What is the oppressor? That, because I feel like that's the problem we have now, right? Like, you're going to oppress me or you're going to oppress me. I don't care. I know where I'm going to be. I'm going to be at the bottom. So we have to build a different thing that people would actually defend. I remember at Miller School, when we had built like an arts program that people there appreciated, we had the most students, most parents at the, when they tried to close the school, we had the most parents of any of the, even white schools, we had more people than everybody. Because the parents were like, this is, I care about this. But if it's just conceptually, so I feel like we've got it wherever we are. And even for our defense, like if we don't name socialism, they're gonna pick off the few socialists that they see. So I really feel like one thing I'd like us to continue to work on is like, no, study it, figure it out, even if socialism is a process to communism or to anarchism, whichever one if you're figuring it out, but not hiding the word. Because I feel like that's what they're afraid of, is that the idea catches on, and I just wonder whether or not, you know, to the point you're raising, if people do it in countries that they know they're going for a federated, what's lost by trying to do the socialist country? And I wonder what I really wonder what I would love to hear what they think about this. You know what I'm saying? I would love to hear and look into more. Did you ever see any comments they made about how they want to frame themselves, like economically, like the ownership structure of anything that they say?
I'm not sure. For me personally, what I've seen hasn't been in depth, but I know that they have named, specifically in Burkina Faso, called back very, very often to the legacy left by Thomas Sankara, or pan-Africanists globally. Folks hold Sankara in such high regard because of the role he played in Burkina Faso. And even though, you know, he was assassinated and the West regained control and influence over Burkina Faso in that time, the legacy left by that socialist government that was leading Burkina Faso at the time is one that socialists, especially Pan-African socialists, study and hold in hugely high regard. And so there's often many callbacks in terms of, okay, the vision we have is a continuation of what Thomas Sankara was working on, at least in Burkina Faso, I can speak to that. And, you know, like I mentioned before, the Prime Minister, I believe it's the Prime Minister, I hope I'm not mistaken, but I believe it's the Prime Minister who was actually a part of Thomas Sankara's government. So, yes. And Thomas Sankara was a socialist. So that's something, whatever, you know, anything else about his politics, getting into the specific, he was a socialist and that government was a socialist.
That's right.
Yeah, so.
Well, cool. We're going to show the last slide, I guess, is that cool?
Real quick, any other comments from our?
I can guess, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about like their orientation to Black nationalism and like their orientation to nation states and what that looks like too.
I think that's something that probably would be good to talk about after we like close up too and just kind of chat about it, because I think one thing about us is right now our mission is just to build like a Black socialist presence. So I'm not sure that we even have one solid unified agreement within the BSF about an answer to that question right here. So, and one agreed upon orientation around nationalism. But it's a great question, so yeah, appreciate it. And we have one more.
Oh, sorry, no.
You're good? Okay. Yeah, anyone else?
I have a comment.
Yes, you.
For me, the last one, where it says, what does a truly liberated Africa look like? I always have on my mind, what does a truly liberated Black United States liberation looks like, right? Because it kind of, you know, fits with the question in number two, which, you know, because this is across the US and definitely happening in Pittsburgh, but we just haven't really, I guess, or we have a hard time wrapping our minds around the Black liberation because there are so many, I guess, feet or what have you been on our necks, our backs, and, you know, just because of the theft and things that are really deeply rooted. So I just was a little backwards with it, you know, trying to relate it in the way that I can relate it. You know, outside of Africa, I can relate to Africa because I can understand the history and everything that was stolen and we were stolen, right? So that's as far as I can relate in that kind of a way. But I always say, how can we become Black liberated here and be like the leaders of our own future, our own, and it's been just so hard, right? And even if you're talking about community or schools, whatever you're talking about, we just don't never, I guess, or maybe don't think enough of ourselves for us to drive the train or whatever we're driving, right? A few of us, yeah, and they might say, oh, you're crazy, but you know, it's not crazy. Why can't we be in the driver's seat, right? Or see ourselves here? So.
I'll just say, I feel like that's a very nationalistic comment, and I feel like that's the value, I think, of the internal colony framework. And I feel like we don't know a lot about that in Pittsburgh, is the idea of seeing yourself, because where does the nation come from? If you're not in a group already, where would you create it from? You'd have to be making a new one, right? Which would say you were already in this one. And then why would you leave this one for something, you know? So I do feel like something that we have to frame this point about study, part of this is actually about our own learning. So it's like, we have so much unlearning to do and so much learning to do. But what's exciting to me about learning about the idea of it is to let myself think about what would that mean for so many different things. I think part of these things are more like, not necessarily that they're answers, but they're more like, well, what if you try to think like this, what do you find?
I see Tyra has a question too.
Yeah, I would say that so in the beginning of like some culture, like going back and getting it, because a lot of
I didn't hear you say it again.
like the concept of that culture,
Yeah.
going back and getting it,
Mhm.
so referring to like how we have been able to, you know, push ourselves forward into liberation here. So I think about the Underground Railroad and what was required, to, you know, be able to really like move people from type of enslavement out to type of not legal enslavement anyway. And then the Great Migration, and even how we're in like a second Great Migration. So like I feel like Black people in the United States specifically, like we have always experienced the act of liberating ourselves through physical movement or through like being able to connect from state to state. And the kinds of things that I see now, I don't know, whenever like I visualize, like we're in the middle of a collapsing empire right now, and like we're like, okay, like, well, what happened? Personally, I'm not thinking about this American government as anything other than pop. So what I see standing and what I see being built are like autonomous networks. I see, you know, I would love to see some research about like where the highest concentrations of like Black Americans are. In my head, it's probably the South. So I would even argue that as Black Americans, like, yes, let's like, you know, start with connecting regionally. But when I think of like almost like our immediate ancestral land on this land, it's the South. Like everybody got, you know, or a lot of people got, you know, cousins so even like that, the strength of that connection and, when you're liberating and centering, Southern or Appalachian Black people and like those struggles, that is how you create liberation for Black people everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can wrap, if I could just add one little piece, just, I feel like, one thing I appreciate about these comments too, is just like, it does feel very clear, in the way we're talking about this too, that we see our struggles as linked, and we see our goals and visions as things that are best imagined together in context, in the same context, in the context with each other. And I think that's like one of the really important takeaways for why we need to focus on AFRICOM, why we should focus on African people, why we should focus on having a politics that while we are focused on what's going on with us and our neighbors and the people around us, it's important to be able to develop an internationalist perspective on what's going on too. Because, you know, they've taken, right, from Africa, but they also are taking from Africa, and they're continuing to take from Africa. Just like they're continuing to take from Africans living here, stealing labor, stealing time, stealing, and so, stealing lives, you know, and so, I think it's really important for us to be able to understand how those things are connected, how resistance abroad can inspire resistance here and vice versa, how we can support resistance, outside of this specific land, and how, you know, we all might be able to link up together. So thanks, appreciate y'all. Some info for folks who want to, you know, get some more digging. Black Alliance for Peace is a really great resource for an organization that has done a whole lot of work organizing against U.S. militarism specifically, not only on, especially on the African continent, but also in African centers and foci around the world, like Haiti. I think, Justin, you're a member of the BAPS Haiti Americas team, focuses on Southcom and the U.S. military presence in Haiti and Latin America and South America. So Black Alliance for Peace is great. If you want to connect with them, it's possible to join as an individual, and also, like Justin mentioned earlier, to join as a group, a member organization, which BSF is one of them. And then just some more about the study group, you know. Like we mentioned before, we believe that capitalism cannot and will not serve the majority of Black people, will not serve Black masses, will not lead Black masses to liberation. And through study, we attempt to find this synthesis of socialisms, Black feminisms, Black nationalisms, and pan-africanisms as we study on a path toward liberation. So yeah, that's the study group. And the last thing is just, you know, if you want to stay connected to us, the study group is how to connect with the BSF. So it's a group for Black and African people to study around this synthesis that we just discussed. We've been studying together since March 2023. So we're over a year and a half old, the study group at least now. Originally being a project out of the Pittsburgh Black Worker Center, but now being a project of the Black Socialist Formation. And yeah, if you want to reach out to us, that's our email right there, pbs@pghblackworkercenter.org. Or you can follow us on Instagram at Black Soc Forum, Black Soc Forum, and scan that QR code if you want to go straight to the Instagram like that. But once again, just want to thank everyone for coming. Really appreciate y'all. Thanks, everyone. I'm ready to go.
All right.
Good night.
Have a good one.
Yeah, it's been virtual. Yeah, right.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. Yeah, not at all. Thanks for your comments.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
No, I'm good.
I mean,
Yeah, but they were.
oh, okay.
Yeah, people. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Oh, that's.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm proud of you.